Israel is preparing to sacrifice a Passover lamb on the Temple Mount this year in an effort to stop the pandemic. All of this without a third temple being built and without a sacrifice of a red heifer. How can this happen? And what are the prophetic implications? Are we that much closer to the return of Jesus? That's what we're talking about today, and we're starting right now. But why are these sacrifices important? Well, because from Daniel 8:11, 9:27, and 11:31, we know it is the Antichrist and his armies that do away with the sacrifices during the 70th week of Daniel. Without the sacrifices starting, they can't be taken away. So the beginning of sacrifices is a major sign of the end times. It could even be a sign of the start of a 70th week, or perhaps a sign that we're already in the 70th week. Now, the Israeli Sanhedrin of 70 priests and rabbis have requested the right to sacrifice on the Temple Mount before. This is nothing new, and they have always been turned down. What makes this breaking news is that this year there is a very good chance the sacrifices will take place. Why? One word: pandemic. It is amazing how this is yet another way the coronavirus pandemic may lead to a fulfillment of prophecy. One that was, to me at least, totally unexpected. And this is so prophetically important it can't be overstated. Christians around the world right now are waiting and watching for the sacrifice of the red heifer and for the building of the third temple. And what we're going to discover together in this video is that neither may be necessary for those sacrifices to begin. In fact, in the same way, neither may be necessary before the abomination of desolation at the midpoint. But that will be another video, one I plan to do in tandem with Fisherman, who I know you all like and look forward to. But in this one, we'll concentrate on the sacrifices that may take place in the spring and why that may happen. Dov Stein, president of the Sanhedrin, recently pointed out to both Netanyahu and Trump in a letter that the original Passover sacrifice stopped the spread of the 10th plague in ancient Egypt. At least it did for Israel. And in his opinion, a Passover sacrifice may stop the coronavirus plague in the 21st century. Although he didn't mention it in the letter, there is another example of sacrifices stopping a plague. When King David took a census of Israel contrary to God's command, a plague broke out that claimed nearly 70,000 Israelites. It was at this time the angel of the Lord instructed David to purchase the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And when David sacrificed there, the plague stopped. Although the Sanhedrin's letter was sent to the U.S. president and the Israeli government, they aren't the ones who Jewish authorities need to convince. The Muslim Waqf that controls the Temple Mount are the ones who need to be convinced. If the Muslims and Jews both want this, you know what? It's going to happen. And you might be thinking right now, that is just impossible. But it might be easier than you think. You see, Islam understands the Passover. They consider Moses to be a prophet, and they believe the Exodus occurred. They celebrate it on a holiday they call Ashura. The difference, however, is that the Islamic tradition teaches the Exodus happened on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, instead of on Passover. So Muslims know the Exodus account, and they know it stopped the plague for the faithful at that time. A narrative of the plagues inflicted on Egypt is found in their Quran, 7:103 to 157. Christians usually think the Muslim and Jewish traditions are just miles apart, but as we just saw, that isn't completely true. And after a year of unrelenting pandemic, sickness, death, lockdowns, the Muslim authorities who control the Temple Mount might just be ready to give a Jewish sacrifice a try, especially because the Exodus account is part of their tradition too. A second reason this is a politically opportune time is that control of the Waqf, which has traditionally been 100% Jordanian, seems to be changing. We reported in the summer that it appears the Saudi Arabians now have representation on the Waqf. Given the recent Abraham Accords between Israel and the Gulf Arab states, the Waqf may now be more willing than ever to compromise with Israel. So in several ways, there was never a point in history where there was a more opportune time for the starting of sacrifices to take place. But a lot of you are probably saying, stop, wait a minute. Without a third temple and without a red heifer sacrifice, these sacrifices can't be considered holy and acceptable to God. And we will discuss the temple and red heifer later in this video, but let's spend a moment right now talking about that idea of any sacrifices being acceptable to God. There is no way a Passover sacrifice of an animal is acceptable to God. Jesus was our once and for all Passover sacrifice, and any animal sacrifice done in his place is blasphemous, a total rejection of the blood of the Messiah to take away sin. Jesus addressed the church of Smyrna like this: I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews but are not, and are a synagogue of Satan. This verse may well be describing this very thing, the blasphemy of sacrifices just like this. This is an incredibly important point. Passover lamb sacrifices will not be acceptable to God, and because they aren't, they don't really need to adhere to biblical laws and commandments to still be the sacrifices mentioned by the prophet Daniel. They only have to adhere to Jewish laws and regulations. If the Jewish authorities think they're kosher, well, they're acceptable to them, then that is all that matters. I know that is hard to hear and shocking to most. So it is what the Jews think about these sacrifices that matters, not what we as Christians think is necessary or even what's biblical in regard to how the sacrifices are done. I realize this is a very foreign concept to most Christians. We tend to view those who practice Judaism as our brothers, people who sort of worship the same God. But because they are blind to the fulfillment of the sacrificial system, which of course is Jesus, they miss everything. They are no less unsaved than their Muslim neighbors. Let's not forget that. So when we say the sacrifices can take place without a third temple, without a red heifer sacrifice, it has nothing to do with biblical requirements. It has only to do with the Jewish authorities' idea of what is right and correct. If they think the sacrifice can take place that way, then it can. According to Eliyahu Berkowitz of Israel 365 News, in an email he sent to this ministry, quote, in Jewish law, there is a concept of the ideal situation, or the way things should ideally be done, and the less than ideal circumstance that things can be done. In other words, he was saying that the need to do sacrifices can be so overwhelming to the Jewish conception of things that compromises to the ideal, even to the Bible, can be made. So 2 years ago on Hanukkah, the holiday commemorating the rededication of a temple, Jewish authorities dedicated an altar to be used in these sacrifices. The altar is built out of bricks, and it weighs some like 4.5 tons, and the ramp alone is another 2 tons. But actually, the size of this altar is smaller than the original ones used in the first and second temple, and it's smaller than the size specified in the Bible. But that is yet another compromise that the Jewish authorities have had to make in order to render this one mobile. It's on wheels, and it can be wheeled right into its proposed location. But that location is something the Jews believe cannot be compromised. The Jewish authorities believe they must use the original location, the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite that we mentioned earlier, to do the sacrifices. Rabbi Hillel Weiss, a member and spokesman of the new Sanhedrin, indicates that with permission, they would resume sacrifices immediately on the site of the original altar. Although the Passover and daily sacrifices do not require a full temple, they must be done on an altar built according to the requirements of Jewish law and placed at the appropriate spot on a temple mount believed to be several meters east of the Islamic Dome of the Rock. Rabbi Hillel Weiss. Notice that Rabbi Weiss says no temple is needed, but the proximity to the Dome of the Rock, of course, is the reason that Temple Mount sacrifices haven't begun yet. The location of the altar is imagined to be a scant 25 meters east of the Dome of the Rock. One doesn't encroach on the Muslim shrine that closely without their permission. And that is why this moment in history is such an ideal opportunity for that to take place. The pandemic has potentially opened the door. A temporary mobile altar, which is outside the dome, is a whole lot less intrusive and more likely accepted than something within the dome, or worse yet, taking the dome down and building a temple. Many of you, though, are asking, wait a minute. Where did the Jewish authorities get the idea that the altar and the threshing floor was even on the Temple Mount, let alone a few meters east of the dome? In 2005, the Sanhedrin undertook archaeological and biblical investigations of the location of Solomon's temple. After hearing numerous expert opinions, the Sanhedrin accepted the discoveries of archaeologist and architect Lev Rittmeyer, as does this channel, placing the temple on the spot currently occupied by the Dome of the Rock. In this previous video, we discussed Dr. Rittmeyer's discoveries of the remnants of Solomon's original temple on the Temple Mount. You've got to see it if you haven't. Click in the upper right to view the landmark video if you haven't already. But returning to the altar location, once the Holy of Holies location is determined, well, then the altar location can also be figured out with biblical precision. This picture on the screen is from the Sanhedrin's Facebook page and shows the location of the previous temple in red, the Dome of the Rock in gray, and the location of the altar, which can be seen in the lower portion of the screen. It's about 80 feet east of the dome. I think this is a surprise to many Christians who might think their sacrifices took place inside the temple. They didn't. They took place on the brazen altar that was outside the temple building. Thus, to resume sacrifices, a third temple really isn't needed. Just this week, the Temple Institute, the Jewish organization in charge of building the new temple, preparing the implements for sacrifice, and training the priests, posted a very interesting article on this exact subject. 3 prophets returned with Israel from the exile in Babylon. They were Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. The Talmud, the Jewish rabbinical teaching, says, quote, "The 3 prophets returned to the land of Israel with the people. One attested to the size of the altar, the second to its location, and the third attested to the law that permits sacrifices to be offered even if the temple has not yet been built." And if we look in the Bible, sure enough, in Ezra 3, verses 1 through 6, we see that sacrifices were started before the second temple was ever completed. This is an important biblical precedent. If you have thought that the temple was needed prior to beginning of sacrifices, well, kind of like I did, well, we all need to rethink our positions on this point. But what about the red heifer? In the summer, we spent 3 videos discussing the red heifer and how one is absolutely necessary for the priest to be ritually clean in order to do a sacrifice. And that is absolutely biblically correct. You can click right here to see the most popular of these videos if you need to refresh your memory. And I'm not 100% sure we won't have a red heifer by Passover. However, just like the Jewish authorities are willing to compromise on a lot of other things, they appear to be willing to compromise on not having ritually clean priests who would require the ashes of a heifer. Rabbi Weiss comments on this as well. Despite various issues of Jewish law, such as ritual impurity and the lack of a high priest, Jews are still required and technically able to bring the sacrifice. In our opinion, although the Jewish authorities are willing to compromise on this issue, they may have a red heifer sacrifice before the spring anyway. In that previous video, we indicated that the heifer that came of age in August was only a few red hairs short of being kosher, and maybe it's ready for sacrifice now. They also investigated a heifer in October found in South America, and another heifer comes of age in February. So as of February, they may have 3 candidates. and the Jewish authorities caring for those animals who regularly brought updates throughout all of 2020 have been strangely silent since August. Totally silent on the issue. Why? Maybe because they have the heifer they desire and don't want to alert animal rights activists or Islamic extremists who could interfere with the sacrifice. Only time will tell if they have this animal. But either way, as we just saw, the authorities are ready to do a Passover lamb sacrifice regardless. All they need is the approval from the Waqf and the Jewish government. All of us should be prepared because we may see this sacrifice take place in a matter of 2 months. Amazing. But there is one other important sacrifice issue we haven't discussed yet. And that is that the sacrifices that are ended by the Antichrist and his forces in Daniel 8, 9, and 11 are the twice daily regular sacrifices, not the Passover sacrifice. So these must begin as well, not just the once-a-year Passover sacrifice. Now exactly how that happens, how the Muslims accept additional sacrifices isn't clear to me. It may be related to the pandemic as well. Perhaps after a Passover sacrifice, caseloads drop, but then maybe they escalate again, and the Jewish authorities use that to suggest starting the twice daily sacrifices. We really don't know. It's just an idea. If you have other ideas on how the twice daily might get started, please leave us a comment. However, the start of sacrifices is only a sign, not the sign that Jesus spoke of. That sign, of course, is the abomination of desolation. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. We have just seen that animal sacrifices can happen in a matter of months without a temple and without a red heifer. But what about this abomination of desolation? Can it possibly take place without a temple? I'm sure you're thinking it can't. After all, doesn't the Bible say that the man of sin sits in the temple of God? But click right here to keep watching our video on that subject. If it can happen without a third temple being present, nearly every Christian on the planet who is looking for this event, as Jesus instructed us to do, will be shocked and surprised, and the Great Tribulation might start sooner than one expects. This is Nelson, and I'll see you there.